thoughts, it's called the New Old Age religion by some people. Buddhism can be credited for the implementation of several cults. We're familiar with Scientology. Scientology is rooted in Buddhist doctrine. How many of you have ever heard of Erhard Seminar Training? Have any of you ever heard of that? It's kind of a significant training. It's an organization or a thought or a doctrine that was developed by a gentleman named Erhard or Werner H. Erhard, and it's called EST, Standard Training. And I wanted to talk about it just a little bit because I wanted you to know a little bit about how these type of thoughts have infiltrated your country. EST training has a purpose, and this is the purpose in their purpose statement, to transform one's ability to experience living so that the situations one has been trying to change or been putting up with clear up just in the process of life itself. Want me to say that again? Okay. The purpose of EST, Erhard Seminar Training, is to transform one's ability to experience living so that the situations one had been trying to change or had been putting up with clear up just in the process of life itself. Now, EST training began in America, well, it began by Erhard in 1971. And it's a participatory type training. It's 2 weeks, 60 hours total. It's usually done in residence. And the idea, it enables participants to shift their state of mind around which their lives are organized in attempt for them to reach self-satisfaction. Now so in that self-satisfaction, people can experience and be satisfied with themselves and be complete with themselves at the present moment in their life. Now you might be asking why I'm even talking about this. Well, EST training over the years has metamorphosed, as does Buddhism, into several different arenas in our country. The first EST course, of course, was taught in San Francisco, California, which makes perfect sense. Within a year, it was being taught in all the major cities of America. This is back in the early 70s. Remember what the world was like in the early 70s. Soon after that, EST training was adopted by the United States penitentiary system and was begun to be taught at federal prisons. I tell you that so that you'll understand that one of the individuals who participated in EST training in the Lompoc, California federal prison was a man named Matthew Landy Steen. Matthew Landy Steen is a friend and associate of a gentleman who's a friend of our president, William Ayers. They were both members of the Weathermen. So there's a connection in EST with, remember I've spoken before of the mindset of the people that came out of the 70s, the people that came out of the cultural revolution of the 70s who decided that our culture was no good. The basic Judeo-biblical culture that we have, the people that came out of the cultural revolution of the 70s decided it's no good. Capitalism is not right. We need to change our nation foundationally. These are the people that are now in charge of your government. This is Bill and Hillary Clinton. This is Barack Obama. This is people like William Ayers, who participated in blowing up a police station, I think.
Blew up a police station, blew up the side wall of the Pentagon.
Yeah. But so I bring up something like that so you see, and EST expanded into Europe. It was offered in Israel, in Tel Aviv. It metamorphosed in the 80s. Originally EST was a non-for-profit corporation. In the 80s, it became an educational institution that provides textbooks to public schools. It's called Landmark Education. Sounds pretty upright, forthright. That's Landmark Education. The president of Landmark Education, the CEO, is Erhard's brother. Erhard, in his, there's a biography written about him by a gentleman named William Bartley. Erhard said about himself that Zen Buddhism is what gave him the space to come up with the idea for EST. Zen Buddhism gave him the space. By that he means Zen Buddhism expanded his horizons to the point where he could come up with such a good idea as EST. He went on to say, it was not such an influence on me, sure. Rather, it created space. It allowed those things that were there to be there. Okay, whatever that means. And it gave me a form of experience. It built up in me the critical mass from which was kindled the experience that produced EST. People that have been Cher is an EST person. Cloris Leachman, some of you might remember Cloris Leachman. Yoko Ono is an EST person, graduate of the class. John Denver, Jeff Bridges. So, and then I think it was in the late 70s, they opened another branch of EST, and it's called the Hunger Project. And the Hunger Project was formed in 1977. It was in the 70s. And the Hunger Project now works hand in hand with the United Nations. And they declared in 1977 that they would eradicate hunger in the world by 1997. That hasn't worked real well. But they are promoting EST in third world countries as a way of defeating hunger. How does that work? And our tax dollars, which support the UN, go to support the Hunger Project, just so you know. So to get back to the point at hand, in many ways Buddhism has become a foundational presence in the world of spiritualism. If you go to places, how many of you have been to Sedona?
Where?
Taos, New Mexico. Places where palmistry is big, tarot card readings, crystals. Pardon me?
New Orleans is like that.
Yeah, New Orleans. In those environments, a lot of the beliefs that are espoused are in fact Buddhist beliefs. And the thing about Buddhism, when you think of Buddhism, it's probably harder to understand than Hinduism. And if any of you understood Hinduism from my discussion last week, you're doing better than I did. And I've studied it, and it's still hard for me to understand. But if you want to try to understand Buddhism, the best thing to do is to look at its roots and try to examine its central beliefs. So that's where we'll start. Buddhism was born from Hinduism. The founder of Buddhism is a gentleman named Siddhartha Gautama. And he was alive, this religion predates Jesus Christ. He was alive in 563 BC to 483 BC. His father was a tribal chief in northeastern India, or what we would probably call today Nepal. And he was raised a Hindu very noble and privileged family. He had everything. And for an Hindu, remember we looked at the Hindus, the higher up you are on the social circle, the more holy you are, for lack of a better phrase. The better off you are. Why are you better off? Why are you holier if you're in the higher social scale? Because you have been reincarnated into a higher circle because you're a good person. So he comes from a good family. He doesn't need, he has very few needs in his life. But in 534 BC, he leaves home. And when he leaves home, he's confronted with the peasantry. And he sees all the pain, all the suffering, all the agony, disease, sickness, how people are starving. And he says there's something wrong. So at that moment, in that spiritual unrest, he began, according to this religion, he began his spiritual quest. He believed that by depicting, remember in Hinduism, evil and suffering are what? What is suffering in Hinduism? It's not real. Remember? Hindus do not believe that suffering is real. It's an illusion. That's why they're stuck suffering all the time, because it ain't real. So there's nothing you can do. I'm serious. These religions, you got to remember, these religions are inspired by Satan. And all he wants is to keep people in these vicious circles that they're in. So he felt that because of Hinduism's teaching that suffering was an illusion, Hinduism was ignoring the masses. So he also believed that Hinduism was very confusing and complex, and he's right about that. But remember, he thought that was confusing. Wait until we get into what the Buddhists believe. So he became disenchanted with his affluent lifestyle, and he left his wife, and he left his son, and he left the palace and his wealth, and he began this spiritual quest. And he wandered through the countryside of India and Nepal for 6 years. He meditated, he studied, and he asked questions. And he was said in one of the fables, he is said to have virtually starved himself to death, to the point where he took a bath and almost drowned because he was so weak from the lack of food, because he was on a spiritual quest. When he reached the city of Bodh Gaya, he sat under a fig tree next to a river. Some of this is hard to read. And he refused to rise again until he found the answer to life. Now, for a Hindu, what would be the answer to life? What's the Hindu's goal? Nirvana. Remember, we've talked about nirvana. Okay, and how does a Hindu get to nirvana? They do good enough stuff, they do good works, and they can reach nirvana if you do good works. Well, this gentleman, who becomes known as Buddha now, his name changes to Buddha, he meditates under this fig tree next to the river for 49 days. And he's in a trance, and in his trance he battles with the god Mara. And we learned about Mara. Mara is the evil god of Hinduism. In fact, there is a sect of Hindus that worship Mara. And there are some very mean people. So after his battle, he became enlightened, and in his enlightenment, he reached nirvana. He got to nirvana in a different way than a Hindu could. And because of that, he began a religion that is known as Buddhism. And his path that he followed was radically different from the Hindu path. Remember, the Hindu path is you go around in these circles, and you keep going, and you try to do better stuff. And if you're good, when you die, you get reincarnated as something better. If you're bad, you come back as a roach or something like that. That's why they don't kill nothing, because that might be your Uncle Tom right there. If you step on him, you might. And then if he's been bad, he's going to come back something worse than a roach. So He had a new way of getting to the center of the circle. So Buddha said, rather than ignoring suffering, you need to embrace it. Rather than seeking the help of the millions, there's actually over 3 million gods in Hinduism, Buddha says you need to focus on the goal, nirvana. Don't worry about the gods, focus on the goal. And he called his new teaching the middle way, because it represented neither extreme indulgence or extreme denial. So one of the profound differences then between Hinduism and Buddhism is that Buddhists, even atheistic Buddhists, even atheistic Hindus claim that there are personal gods that take care of them personally, but they still don't believe in the big God. A good Buddhist would say there are no gods. A good Buddhist believes in, for lack of a better phrase, the force. Sound familiar? The force is with you. And a good Buddhist believes that the force is everywhere. The force is in you, it's in me, it's in the trees, it's in the ground, it's the force. The force, have you ever fried fish at home? And it stinks up the whole house? It makes everything stink? That's the force. The force makes everything smell like fish. But in this instance, the Buddhists believe it makes it smell like God. God is in everything. God is in everywhere. And there's no personal gods. The Greeks had personal gods. They had remember when Paul went to Athens in Acts, you walk down the street and there's all these gods. There's even a statue for the unknown God. And he told them, well, you guys got one statue. But I'll tell you about the unknown God. I know the unknown God, and his name is Jesus Christ. And his Father is God. So, but back in Acts 19, so in one way, the Buddhists would be in agreement with Paul since there is no personal God. The problem is the Buddhists believe that God is not a he. They believe God is a force. The force is with you. They believe he's an energy. The teachings of Buddhism, if you had a Buddhist magnet and you held it over the United States of America, and it was a real strong magnet, that magnet would move out towards the west. If it was searching for the heaviest concentration of Buddhist belief, it would move out towards the west. And when it got over Hollywood in California, it would be most attractive. Most of the things that kids are watching in movies today, a lot of it has roots in Buddhism. Because a lot of the people there believe those type of things. So, now remember I said that he was trying to start Buddhism because he thought Hinduism was confusing. And I don't think he really succeeded at that. But he believed that human beings are the center of the universe. Okay? We call that humanism. We teach that in our universities. We even have a nice name for it. We call it humanities. Everybody has to take humanities in college. And all of these people, everybody shares a common energy or a common force. So with Buddhists, when you're trying to relate to somebody who has Buddhist beliefs, you're relating to somebody that does not recognize a personal God. They do not recognize a God who is a one-on-one type of God. They don't have the same concept that we have of God. In Acts 17, Paul makes a point about one living God, if you want to look at Acts 17. Acts 17, look in verse 22. Should be the... Acts 17, 22. 22 says, "And then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, 'Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious.'" He told them, "You guys are religious guys. I can see that." You know how he knew that? Because you got all those statues to all those gods now. "I can see that you are very religious. For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription to the unknown God. Therefore the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you. God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with man's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined the pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings." God even determines county lines, if you want to think of it that way. "So that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him. Though he is not far from each of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. As also some of your own poets have said." And Paul uses a very good technique. He quotes a famous Greek poet, "For we also are his offspring. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we might not ought to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. Truly, these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by his raising him from the dead." So Paul right there gives us a very short and quick dissertation of how to witness to a Buddhist or in fact a Hindu. Because see, in Buddhism, since God is everywhere and is in everything, people have very little value. Remember, we talked about that. The Hindus are the same way. So, because everybody is one little piece, a cog in the big divine wheel of the universe. And Paul emphasizes the point here that God is not part of creation. God is the creator. That he determines our boundaries, he's our Lord, and we are a special, unique creation made in his image. You know, as you consider a religion like Buddhism, when you go into a Christian bookstore today, how many different flavors of Bibles do they have? They got all different types of interpretations. They have men's Bibles, they have women's Bibles, they have teens, they have kids, they have couples, they have 365-day-a-year Bibles, they have devotional Bibles, they have every kind of Bible. One of the problems with understanding Buddhism is they don't all believe in the same book. You know, generally speaking, the majority of Christians believe in the Bible that has an Old Testament, a New Testament, and generally speaking has 66 books. But with Buddhism, it's different. So when you look at Buddhism, you have to look at what each group believes. And I'll try to go through these as quickly as possible because I know you're just enthralled with this. But we'll be done with this section tonight, and then next week we'll start looking at Judaism. And that Judaism will speak to you much better. But the first group we have to look at are for 200 years after Buddha died, he had several thousands of followers. And they were unified as a cohesive unit. But around the 3rd century BC, after they had been around a couple hundred years, they had a major crisis in the religion. Not much different than Christianity, incidentally. And the question that arose is that can a person who has reached enlightenment, can they guide other people towards the same goal? Okay, do they have that responsibility? It's kind of like a Christian. You know, there are Christians that say they don't have any responsibility to lead any Christian to the Lord. They don't have that responsibility. That's what the thought behind Arminianism is. Arminianism believes that it's all preordained. What are you doing? don't need to do it, God will do it. That's what our meaning meant. So the first group, are the Theravada Buddhists, and they are the original foundational Buddhists. And then the ones that split off of them are the Mahayana Buddhists. And the Mahayanas believe that they had an obligation to help other people find salvation. Nirvana is salvation in Buddhism. Okay? So, if you were going to characterize the Mahayanas, they are evangelicals. Okay? They're evangelical in their beliefs. What is an evangelical? Since we use the word.
It's an enthusiastic believer.
Enthusiastic believer. Okay. When did evangelicism, when was it born? And who was it born with? 1700s.
Martin Luther?
Would have been considered, Martin Luther was the father of Reformation, the reformer. But evangelicalism began with one particular religion, which is today's Methodist. The Methodists and the Lutherans that were called Pietists were the first evangelicals. And they are. What did you call them?
Enthusiastic.
Enthusiastic, yeah. That describes them. And that's the birthplace, Methodist, and the parts, sects of the Lutherans are the birthplace of Protestantism. And evangelical belief became a movement early in the 1700s, mainly with the Methodist in England, and then the Pietist, Pietists, Lutherans that lived in Germany and Scandinavia. And it grew pretty good in Europe, pretty good. It really grew when it got to America. And the reason why it really grew in America were the same thing that we need right now, because there were two great awakenings. Remember, we've looked at the Great Awakenings. The Great Awakenings are what formed the thought processes of our founding fathers.
Amen.
That's how they got convinced that God was more important than man. Because prior to that, there wasn't a lot of that thought around. So, evangelicals believe in de-emphasizing ritual. Okay? Is the Catholic Church evangelical? No. Now, some Catholics are evangelical in nature, but the church itself, the Catholic Church does not go out and try to win converts. That's why they baptize you at birth. You are. You is a Catholic. So they have no need. There's no need for salvation. You're already saved by infant sprinkling or whatever you call it. But evangelicals de-emphasize ritual, and they emphasize the piety, the condition of the individual. And evangelicals expect each other to reach or to adhere to certain personal commitments in their religious life. Things like personal conversion. What's another word for personal conversion? What does Jesus tell Nicodemus in John 3? You must be born again. Evangelicals believe to be saved, you have to be born again. Evangelicals have very, very high regard for the Word of God. Okay? Evangelicals teach and proclaim the saving death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Evangelicals believe in actively sharing the gospel to the world. That's what makes evangelicals. We're non-denominational, but we are evangelicals at heart. Southern Baptists, Conservative Baptists, like I said, most of the Methodists would be considered evangelical. So, getting back to the Buddhists, the Theravada Buddhists, they would be considered classical Buddhist, and they attempted to follow the original teachings and doctrines of Buddha. So they have a book called the Tripitaka, which teaches them all about Buddha. And these Buddhists live mainly in Cambodia, Laos, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. The Reformed Buddhist is what I'll call them, the ones that believe that you need to evangelize people to help them find nirvana, salvation. When they became a group, they have the same holy book, but they have other holy books. They use some of the Hindu books. They use some of the shamanistic books. Remember we talked about the shamans? The shamans, when Marty and Sylvia went, where did they go? Thailand?
Yes.
They went to Thailand. They were confronted with a lot of animists, people that believe that God is in the animals, the trees. That's all Buddhist, and that's part of the teachings that this particular sect of Buddhism has. This is big in China, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Japan. There's another kind of Buddhism which is called Theravada Buddhism, and it's popular. I don't know, most of you have heard of the Dalai Lama. You remember the Dalai Lama? Who lives in exile. I think he's supposed to live in Tibet, but the Chinese don't let him go there because they're worried if he ever gets there that he'll lead him some kind of revelation. He's the 14th incarnation of a teacher who is supposedly a teacher of compassion in Buddhism. So that belief, I don't even know where that belief comes from. There's another form of Buddhism that's believed in Japan, started around 1250 AD, very strict form. These are the Buddhists that are into karma. They're into, and karma is the Hindu law of cause and effect, remember? And if you have bad karma, it's because somebody's getting back at you, and it's okay to get back at people. Yeah. And that form of Buddhism is very strong in India today. And then the last one is really the Buddhism of America. And the Buddhism of America is Zen Buddhism. And it's what is most recognizable in the Western world. It's interesting, not only because of what it teaches, but because of what it doesn't teach. Because it has no sacred books. So if you want to be a Zen Buddhist, you meditate. And it has no central doctrine. There is really no central organization. There's no headquarters of the Zen Buddhist. And Zen Buddhism is based upon a gentleman who was a personal disciple of Buddha. And Buddha picked a flower and talked into it. And the flower telekinetically spoke to this guy and told him how to be a Zen Buddhist. And he reached nirvana. And that's what these people believe. That's their belief. And there's millions of, I wonder if they think, do you think Zen Buddhists think Christians are crazy?
Yes, of course they do.
So if there was a Zen Buddhist teacher, preacher up here talking about Christians, do you think that the Zen Buddhist in the audience would have the same look on their face that you do when I talk about, have you ever thought about that? About things. I do.
But you're describing some people that I know.
Do you? Am I?
I mean, picking up little things about all the stuff that you said in it, because I don't pay any attention to that, because I just go along with it, so little Buddha guys sitting around.
Oh, yeah.
And all this kind of stuff, and I'm thinking, what
noticed that had a Buddha in the front yard, by the front door. And I think that's where they're supposed to be. And we had her son come to the, remember Larry?
Oh, but they're from Laos.
Yeah, they were from Laos. And we let Larry come to the Christmas school. And he made a profession of faith. We told his parents, we're going to teach him about Jesus. But, so this guy, his name is Mahakasyapa. He was telekinetically told by a flower how to reach nirvana. And he is the proponent of what is called the doctrine of the Buddhist mind. And Zen Buddhism is big in China, it's big in Japan, it's the biggest form of Buddhism in Western Europe, and it's the biggest form of Buddhism in the United States of America. Yes.
Is yoga
Yeah.
related to that?
And there is some really weird stuff. I had to almost edit some of it. There's some really, really, really perverted beliefs. There's a lot of sexual, just a lot of junk that is part of their foundational teaching. How to reach these euphoric states. And it's pretty disturbing when you really start looking at it. And to think that all over the face of the earth, because there's a lot of Buddhists in the world, you know. In that part of the world, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of Buddhists, there's a lot of Hindus, and there's a lot of Buddhists. And there are people in these countries that are perishing. And I firmly believe that some of them have never heard the word of God. Now that doesn't mean that they don't know of God. Because Romans teaches us that everyone knows of God. But a lot of them have never heard the word of God. And that's why missions, evangelicals believe that missions is so important. But that one sect of Buddhism wants to get more Buddhists. And there's a lot of confirmed Buddhists in Hollywood. A lot of the creative people. They meditate.
But it all boils down to one four-letter word: self. It does. Every piece of it, all of these different religions, all boil down to me. It's about me.
Yeah, they're all very humanistic.
That's the common denominator.
They're all very humanistic. Wait till we get into Islam. We'll start Islam in 2 weeks. Well, I think Judaism will probably might take 2 weeks. Okay, anything else? Then we'll be done.
So the question was, why are the, what is the question, Tiff? Ask the
I
question.
asked, why are all the Buddhas so fat if this guy sat by a tree and
Thank you.
That was after
That's a
Nirvana.
great question.
Nirvana?
Was it
That's
good?
Nirvana?
You know, behind him, there's a big bowl of rice.